63 homeowners had already paid nearly $1 million into their reserve fund when HOA President Marlene Whitaker stood up and demanded $12,000 more from every single household. She blamed a failing road and a collapsing roof. Grant Holloway, a quiet neighbor no one really knew, asked to see the bank statement instead. What he found stopped him cold. The account meant to hold over $900,000 had only $14,000 left in it. Marlene threatened him, fined him, and tried to silence him. She never imagined it would end with federal agents walking through that door. Silver Pines was a gated community of 63 homes, tucked against a quiet range of hills with a landscaped lake, a community clubhouse, its own drainage system, and nearly 4 miles of private road. Every household paid $540 a month in dues, a portion of which was funneled into a reserve fund meant for major repairs like the clubhouse roof, the water lines, and the roadway itself. Grant had bought his house there 3 years earlier and kept mostly to himself, rarely appearing at community gatherings or getting drawn into neighborhood disputes. His neighbors knew only that he had once worked in construction. What none of them knew was that he had spent 2 decades running an audit division that investigated financial losses on projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that instinct never really left him. One morning, a letter arrived from the HOA demanding an additional $12,000 from each household within 30 days, citing a failing road, a collapsing drainage system, and a clubhouse roof on the verge of caving in, along with a claim that the reserve fund was nearly empty. Grant found the claim absurd almost immediately. The previous year's report had shown the reserve fund holding more than $900,000, and an independent engineering survey had confirmed no major repairs would be needed for at least 3 years. He walked the road himself and found only minor cracking, nothing close to the catastrophic failure described in the letter. He inspected the clubhouse roof from outside and noticed it had clearly been replaced less than 2 years earlier. He spoke with Wayne Prescott, a homeowner who had lived in Silver Pines for nearly 2 decades, and Wayne told him that special assessments had become more and more frequent since Marlene took over as president 4 years earlier. In that time, residents had been billed for security cameras that were never fully installed, a security gate that broke down constantly, landscaping services priced 3 times higher than comparable neighborhoods, and a lake treatment project no one had ever been shown a contract for. Grant sent a polite email requesting copies of the reserve fund's bank statements, and Marlene responded that only board members could access what she called sensitive financial documents. Grant cited the exact clause in the Silver Pines governing documents confirming every homeowner had the right to review the books. 3 days later, he received a formal warning letter accusing him of harassing a volunteer board member, staring at the demand for $12,000. Grant understood this was no longer a case of poor management. Someone was working very hard to hide an enormous hole in the community's finances, and the fear in that warning letter told him just how close he had already gotten. Marlene called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse and sat at the front of the room, flanked by Beverly Stanton and Denise Caldwell, with a slideshow behind them showing zoomed-in photographs of cracks in the pavement. She announced that Silver Pines was facing an infrastructure crisis and presented estimates of $756,000 to repave the roads and $310,000 for new drainage without a single itemized bid engineer's name or procurement record attached. When a homeowner asked what the reserve fund's actual balance was, Beverly only said the money had been depleted by years of emergency expenses. Grant stood and asked 3 questions. What was the exact current balance of the reserve fund who had approved the largest expenditures, and why had homeowners never once been shown a bank statement? The room went completely silent. Marlene told him he simply didn't understand the complexity of running a community, and Grant calmly replied that he had audited thousands of construction invoices in his career and only needed to see a consolidated ledger to know whether a special assessment made any sense at all. She shifted to personal attacks, calling him a newcomer with no community spirit who was manufacturing chaos to avoid paying his fair share. While Denise warned that any household failing to pay the $12,000 on time would face fines, a lien, and possible legal action, many homeowners in the room simply lowered their heads, too afraid to say anything more. Grant noticed Beverly looked tense throughout, avoiding the screen behind her almost the entire time. After the meeting ended, Loretta Gaines, a retired bank employee, quietly slipped Grant a piece of paper with a single line written on it. Last year's report showed $934,280, and there was no way that much money could disappear without leaving a trail. Loretta told Grant she had kept an old printed copy of a financial report from before the HOA moved everything to an online portal, and it showed the reserve fund growing steadily year after year. Together, they began comparing what the HOA had claimed publicly against what appeared to actually exist on the ground, and they found project after project listed as completed that barely seemed to exist at all. $84,000 had supposedly gone to new security cameras, yet only 3 old ones remained. $126,000 was billed for lake treatment, though the lake had never once been closed for work. $71,500 covered a clubhouse roof replacement, despite insurance already having paid for most of it, and $48,000 went to emergency consulting, with no company name attached. Anywhere. Grant decided to hold off on confronting the board again until he had something undeniable. But Marlene struck first, sending a notice, accusing him of spreading misinformation and damaging the community's reputation, a move that told Grant she wasn't simply being defensive. She was afraid. In the days that followed, Grant kept a private notebook where he tracked every inconsistency he found, cross-referencing dates on invoices against weather records, permit filings, and even old photographs neighbors had posted showing the state of the road years earlier. He noticed that several of the largest repair claims referenced storm damage from a season when local records showed almost no significant rainfall at all. He also noticed that HOA meeting minutes from that period, the ones posted publicly on the online portal, described votes that seemed to happen in under 2 minutes for expenditures worth well over $100,000, far too quickly for any real deliberation to have taken place. Grant began to suspect the online minutes had simply been written after the fact to match whatever numbers Marlene needed to justify. Grant sent a certified request to inspect the HOA's records, citing both state law and the community's own governing documents, and attorney Claudia Monroe replied that he could view the files for 2 hours at the management office, but would not be permitted to photograph or copy anything. He agreed anyway, knowing the restriction was likely improper, but unwilling to waste time fighting it in advance. Denise sat across from him the entire time as he worked through disorganized folders full of missing pages and unsigned photocopied invoices. Grant didn't need to copy everything. He simply memorized the structure and wrote down the numbers that mattered most. The most recent bank statement showed the reserve fund holding only $14,227. While the prior year-end report had shown more than $934,000, a gap of nearly $920,000. He kept digging and found dozens of payments routed to a single company called Everhart Community Services, which had apparently been paid for road repair, lake consulting, landscape design, roof inspection, drainage maintenance project, management, and even security services. One company somehow qualified to do everything at once. The invoices tended to use round numbers, vague descriptions, and approval signatures from either Marlene or Beverly. When Grant asked Denise about the bidding process, she claimed the board had emergency authority to hire contractors without collecting multiple quotes, but Grant pointed out that most of these invoices had nothing to do with any actual emergency. Denise cut the review short and asked him to leave. Later that night, Grant searched public business filings and discovered that Everhart Community Services belonged to a man named Miles Everhart, who had once co-owned a vacation property with Marlene more than 200 miles from Silver Pines. He couldn't yet prove an ongoing relationship, but the connection was enough to keep pulling the thread. Loretta noticed something else while reviewing his notes. Many of the largest payments had been broken into smaller transactions, each one kept under $50,000, a pattern that could easily be used to dodge broader approval requirements or independent audit thresholds. Grant built a simple timeline and noticed that every time the HOA collected a special assessment, Everhart Community Services received a large payment within just a few weeks afterward. Wayne helped him check the physical sites listed on the fraudulent invoices, and together they recorded video showing no new drainage system, no new pavement, no $62,000 row of trees, and no $39,000 lake lighting system anywhere on the property. Grant arranged a private meeting with 8 homeowners he trusted, and rather than accusing Marlene of theft outright, he simply laid out the numbers and explained that the reserve fund was missing close to $920,000, with no evidence of matching work. Some in the group were too frightened of retaliation to say much, and one person quietly suggested Grant should simply sell his house and move on. Grant told them that if everyone gave up and left, Marlene would only do the same thing to the next family who moved in. A few nights later, an envelope with no name on it appeared at his front door containing a complete 18-month bank statement he had never been shown. Someone inside the board had finally decided to turn against Marlene. Grant spent the entire night studying the statement and found that beyond Everhart Community Services, money had also flowed to 3 other companies: North Ridge Consulting, Pinecrest Safety Solutions, and Whitestone Landscape Management. North Ridge Consulting was registered to nothing more than a commercial mailbox address. Pinecrest Safety Solutions was tied to a small apartment and held no license to provide any kind of security work at all. Whitestone Landscape Management used a phone number that matched an old personal contact number once used by Beverly Stanton. A clear pattern was emerging. Money moved from the reserve fund into these companies, and a portion of it appeared to circle back as personal payments, loan repayments, or real estate expenses. Grant didn't yet have access to the receiving accounts, but the connections were already alarming enough to raise serious questions. Loretta examined the signatures on several transfer authorizations and noted they didn't quite match Beverly's signature on older HOA documents, raising the uncomfortable possibility that someone had signed on her behalf or used an electronic signature without her direct involvement. Grant began to wonder whether Beverly was a willing participant or someone being controlled by Marlene entirely. Meanwhile, Marlene fought back with fines, hitting Grant with a $500 penalty for supposedly using his home for commercial investigative activity, followed a week later by another fine because Wayne's car had been parked in front of his house too long. Denise sent a letter demanding Grant stop holding any gatherings that hadn't been pre-approved by the board, and Marlene announced the HOA would soon vote on amending its governing rules to let the board restrict access to financial records whenever a review was deemed disruptive. Grant understood exactly what that meant. They were trying to slam the door shut before he could get his evidence out. He reached out to the state attorney general's office and a real estate regulatory agency, but the initial response was slow, with officials asking for more detailed records and noting that HOA disputes were usually treated as civil matters. Grant realized he needed to prove this was far more than a rules violation, that it could amount to bank fraud, interstate wire transfers, and organized embezzlement. Grant also began paying closer attention to how the board treated dissent in general, and he realized the pattern went back further than his own arrival at Silver Pines. Wayne recalled an older resident, a widow named Carol Simmons, who had once questioned a landscaping bill years earlier and was suddenly hit with 3 separate code violation notices within a single month, notices that quietly disappeared once she stopped asking questions. Another family had been publicly accused of violating a fence height rule that didn't even exist in the governing documents, an accusation that vanished the moment they backed down from a dispute over a paving contract. It became clear to Grant that intimidation wasn't a new tactic Marlene had developed in response to him specifically. It was simply how she had always protected the scheme, and he had only been the first person with the background to see through it. A homeowner named Raymond Ellis mentioned he had repeatedly seen Miles Everhart's car pulling up to Marlene's house late at night, and Wayne dug up old social media photos showing Marlene, Miles, Beverly, and Denise vacationing together at a lakeside house during the exact period the HOA had paid out more than $180,000 for so-called emergency projects. Grant built out a full diagram connecting the board members, the shell companies, their registered addresses, shared property bank transfers, fabricated invoices, and the work that had never actually been done. Then, using a prepaid phone, the person who had left the envelope finally made contact directly. It was Beverly. She said Marlene had used her access to the accounts and pressured her into signing false reports, and she wanted to talk, but only somewhere no one from the HOA would ever see them together. Grant met Beverly at a diner, nearly an hour's drive from Silver Pines, and she arrived visibly anxious, glancing toward the parking lot again and again. She admitted that at first she had believed Marlene was genuinely trying to save the HOA from rising maintenance costs, since Marlene had claimed she needed to move money quickly to Miles Everhart to handle emergencies without causing panic among residents. After a few transactions, Beverly began noticing the invoices didn't match any real work, and when she pushed back, Marlene threatened to pin everything on her since Beverly's signature appeared on the official paperwork. Beverly explained that certain large transfers legally required 2 signatures for approval, so to get around that requirement, Marlene split the payments into smaller pieces, while Denise signed falsified minutes, claiming votes had taken place behind closed doors that had never actually happened. Beverly handed Grant a storage drive containing internal emails, draft invoices, fabricated meeting minutes, a full list of transfers, text messages between Marlene and Miles, and a spreadsheet breaking down how the payments had been divided. In one message, Miles asked Marlene which category the next invoice should fall under, and she told him to file it under drainage since nobody ever checks what's buried underground. Another email revealed Marlene's plan to collect an additional $756,000 from the 63 homeowners to replace the money that had already disappeared before any outside audit could catch it. The $12,000 assessment was never really about road repair at all. It existed to quietly refill a hole that Marlene herself had created. Grant asked Beverly directly whether she had personally profited, and she admitted Marlene had once covered $18,000 of her personal debt through a fake consulting company. Beverly insisted she had wanted to walk away eventually but felt it was already too late by then. Grant told her plainly that she wasn't only a victim since she had signed false reports and accepted money herself. And Beverly broke down crying, though Grant offered no comfort. He told her the only real choice left was to fully cooperate with investigators and accept whatever consequences followed. Grant backed up every document in multiple places and contacted an independent criminal attorney to protect the other homeowners and guide him on transferring the evidence properly, and through that attorney, the full file eventually reached the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Special Agent Dana Mercer called Grant 3 days later and while she wouldn't confirm an official investigation was underway, she asked him not to alert the board and not to attempt accessing any additional accounts on his own. Grant turned over everything he had, and Dana was especially interested in the fact that money had been routed through companies registered in multiple states, since that detail alone could push the case well beyond an ordinary community dispute. A short time later, Marlene announced the final vote on the $12,000 assessment would take place in exactly 2 weeks, believing she only needed to secure the money before Grant could convince enough homeowners to vote against it. Marlene launched a campaign to discredit Grant, sending out a community bulletin claiming an unnamed resident was spreading financial conspiracy theories designed to damage property values, though everyone understood exactly who she meant. Denise personally called several of the community's older residents, warning that if the HOA failed to collect the money, insurance coverage could lapse and home values could plummet. Claudia Monroe sent Grant a letter, demanding he stop distributing what she called stolen documents, and through his own attorney, Grant responded that the materials had come from someone with legitimate access and had already been passed along to law enforcement. Marlene escalated further, placing a temporary lien on Grant's home over unpaid fines, and Grant refused to pay them, knowing that doing so could be read as an admission of wrongdoing. A group of homeowners began quietly distancing themselves from Grant, worried the investigation would only bring bad publicity to the neighborhood, and he lost the support of a few people who had once promised to stand with him. Wayne suggested holding a private meeting to lay out every piece of evidence at once, but Grant refused, since Dana had asked him to keep certain details confidential to avoid tipping off Marlene or risking the destruction of evidence. That silence made Grant appear, to some, like a man making accusations he couldn't actually back up, and Marlene took full advantage of it. In one informal gathering, she claimed Grant had never produced a shred of real proof and was only trying to seize control of the HOA for himself, even suggesting he might be secretly working with a development company to undermine Silver Pines from within. Grant understood she was already building the story she would use to explain away any future accusations, framing everything as a conspiracy against her. Meanwhile, the FBI worked quietly behind the scenes, securing warrants for the bank accounts, tracing the flow of money out of the reserve fund, examining the shell companies, cross-referencing invoices against actual building permits, interviewing former employees of Miles Everhart, and pulling electronic records from service providers. Grant wasn't told the full extent of the progress, only instructed by Dana to keep behaving normally, while Beverly remained on the board to avoid raising suspicion. When Marlene announced the next meeting would require an in-person vote from every homeowner, she was counting on public pressure to force approval, but Grant began speaking privately with residents one at a time, never revealing the confidential documents, only asking a single question: if $920,000 had truly been spent properly, why couldn't the board simply commission an independent audit to prove it? That question spread through Silver Pines faster than Marlene expected, and by the end of that stretch, 41 homeowners had signed a petition demanding the assessment be delayed until an audit was completed. A petition Marlene rejected outright, claiming it hadn't been submitted in the proper form. Soon after, Grant received a short message from Dana: make sure as many homeowners as possible attend the final meeting. On the day of that final meeting, all 63 households were present or represented, the first time the entire community had gathered in one room at once. Marlene walked in wearing a dark suit, radiating confidence, with Denise and Beverly seated on either side of her, while Miles Everhart sat in the front row as a so-called project advisor, and Claudia Monroe attended to oversee the vote. Grant sat in the back with Wayne and Loretta, having promised Dana he wouldn't reveal that the FBI was already involved. Marlene opened with a long speech about community responsibility, warning that if the $12,000 assessment failed, Silver Pines would lose the ability to maintain its gate, its lake, and its clubhouse, and a new budget chart appeared on the screen behind her. Grant immediately noticed the numbers had been altered, since Marlene now claimed the reserve fund had never held more than $240,000, contradicting everything shown in the earlier reports. Loretta stood up at once and said she had an official copy of last year's report bearing Beverly's own signature, but Marlene insisted that document was only an unaudited draft. Grant asked whether Marlene was prepared to swear under oath that the fund had never exceeded $900,000, that Everhart had completed every listed project, that no board member had personally profited, and that no meeting minutes had ever been falsified. Claudia tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but too many homeowners were now demanding answers, and Marlene, perhaps sensing retreat would look worse than confidence, answered every question, insisting Everhart was a reputable company, hired through the proper channels, with every payment approved by the board. Grant turned to Beverly and asked if she could confirm any of it, and Marlene ordered her to read a prepared statement instead. Beverly opened the folder in front of her hands, visibly shaking, and after a long pause, she finally said the meetings described in that statement had never actually taken place. the room erupted immediately. Marlene accused Beverly of being bought off by Grant, but Beverly admitted openly that she had signed false reports, while insisting Marlene had controlled the accounts, chosen the companies, and dictated exactly how each invoice should be labeled. Miles stood up as if to leave only to find Sheriff Nolan Briggs dressed in plain clothes already blocking the exit near the door. Marlene, still failing to grasp how much the room had shifted against her, kept insisting the HOA was a private organization no outsider had any right to interfere with. Grant asked one final question: why did she need another $756,000 if the earlier money had truly been used correctly? Marlene, losing her composure, completely blurted out that the money had to be replaced before any audit could begin. The entire room fell silent, because she had just admitted out loud that there was a hole in the fund that needed to be filled before anyone could look too closely. Claudia turned to stare at Marlene, realizing her own client had been lying to her, as well as to everyone else. At the back of the room, the main doors opened, and Dana Mercer walked in with a team of federal agents behind her. Dana stepped forward and identified herself as the FBI agent leading the federal financial fraud investigation, while additional agents took position at every exit. Sheriff Nolan instructed everyone to remain exactly where they were and not to interfere. Dana then read the arrest warrant for Marlene Whitaker aloud, listing charges that included conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, embezzlement of community funds, falsification of financial records, money laundering, obstruction of an investigation, and conspiracy to collect additional funds specifically to conceal a prior shortfall. Marlene still tried to hold on to her authority, calling it all a misunderstanding and ordering Claudia to stop them, but Claudia reminded her she was the HOA's civil attorney, not Marlene's personal criminal defense counsel. Dana asked Marlene to stand and place her hands behind her back, and in full view of all 63 homeowners, she was handcuffed at the very table where she had once threatened them into silence. Denise Caldwell was arrested next, accused of signing falsified minutes approving fictitious invoices and helping funnel money through the shell companies. Miles Everhart was taken into custody near the door, charged with creating fraudulent invoices, funneling payments back to board members, and concealing assets. Beverly wasn't handcuffed on the spot since she had already signed a cooperation agreement, but Dana made clear she still faced serious criminal exposure with any leniency depending entirely on continued full cooperation. Marlene turned to Beverly and called her a traitor, and Beverly answered that the real betrayal belonged to whoever had taken money from 63 families and then demanded they pay it a second time. Agents seized the HOA's computer, Marlene's phone, and the documents left on the table while Dana announced that simultaneous search warrants were being executed at Marlene's home, the offices of Everhart Community Services, the Lakeside Vacation Property, the HOA's document storage facility, and the offices of the related shell companies. Marlene tried to claim Grant had orchestrated the entire scene, but Dana explained the case had been built on bank records, emails, server data, corporate filings, and testimony from multiple witnesses, and that Grant had simply been the one who first noticed the shortfall. 63 homeowners had lived through years of manufactured emergencies, and no single resident could be blamed for exposing what had already been happening in plain sight. As agents moved through the room collecting evidence, several homeowners finally spoke openly about things they had been too afraid to mention before describing years of quiet threats, sudden fines that appeared right after they questioned an invoice, and neighbors who had sold their homes at a loss, simply to escape the constant pressure. One elderly resident admitted she had considered taking out a loan against her retirement savings just to cover the $12,000 assessment, convinced that refusing to pay would somehow cost her the house entirely. Hearing that, Dana paused the proceedings for a moment and told the room plainly that no one should ever have been made to feel that afraid of the very organization meant to protect their community. Dana revealed that more than $920,000 had been diverted from the reserve fund, and that portions of it had gone toward the Lakeside Vacation Home, a luxury vehicle registered under a company name credit card debt, personal home renovations, vacations, and a private investment account. Marlene was led out between two rows of chairs, and the very people who had once feared her sat in complete silence as she passed. No one mocked her or celebrated out loud. The quiet itself carried more weight than any outburst could have. Outside FBI and sheriff's vehicles filled the lot, and as boxes of seized records were carried out of the HOA office, Marlene finally seemed to understand that her power over Silver Pines was over. Before leaving the room, Dana turned back to the 63 homeowners and told them the arrest wouldn't put money back into their pockets right away, but from that day forward, none of the people responsible would ever touch Silver Pines' accounts again. In the aftermath, a court-appointed administrator took over management of the community on a temporary basis, and every fine issued by Marlene's board during the investigation was suspended. The lien on Grant's home was removed, and the $12,000 special assessment was formally canceled. Federal investigators and prosecutors continued tracing the stolen assets and discovered Marlene hadn't only stripped the reserve fund, she had also used inside knowledge of the HOA to steer insurance landscaping and management contracts toward companies tied to Miles. The total potential damages once inflated invoices, accumulated interest and legal costs were factored and exceeded $1.3 million, and investigators found yet another account holding more than $210,000 registered under a maintenance organization that didn't actually exist. Money that hadn't even been part of the original $920,000 estimate. Loretta helped the temporary administrator review every transaction line by line, while Wayne organized a group of volunteers to inspect which infrastructure repairs were genuinely necessary. An independent engineer eventually concluded the road only needed about $38,000 in localized patching. The drainage system was functioning. Normally, the clubhouse roof required no replacement at all. The lake needed nothing beyond routine upkeep, and absolutely nothing justified the original $756,000 demand. Beverly formally pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for her testimony, admitting she had accepted $18,000 and had repeatedly signed documents she knew to be false. Even with her cooperation, she was permanently barred from any HOA management role and ordered to repay every dollar she had personally benefited from. Denise attempted to claim she had only been following orders, but her own emails showed she had actively proposed threatening homeowners with property liens. Miles tried to shift blame entirely onto Marlene, but the financial records made clear he had personally kept a large share of the stolen funds. Marlene herself initially refused any plea agreement, still convinced the homeowners wouldn't have the patience to see the case through to the end. But prosecutors moved to freeze the vacation home, 2 investment accounts, 3 luxury vehicles, a rental property, and remaining funds held inside the shell, company's assets that could eventually be liquidated to help repay a portion of the SELP, what had been stolen. At the first community meeting after the arrests, several homeowners urged Grant to run for HOA president himself, and he declined. He told them Silver Pines didn't need someone stronger than Marlene sitting in that chair. It needed a system that made it impossible for anyone to become another Marlene in the first place. Grant spent several weeks drafting those reforms with the help of the independent attorney who had first guided him toward the FBI, making sure every proposal could actually survive a legal challenge, rather than existing only as a well-meaning suggestion. He circulated a plain-language summary to every household so no one would need a law degree to understand what they were voting on, something Marlene's board had never once bothered to do. Grant proposed a set of reforms: an independent audit conducted every year, quarterly public disclosure of the reserve fund's bank statements, and a requirement for 2 signatures on any expenditure above $10,000, at least 3 competing bids for any major contract, a ban on board members, hiring relatives or business partners, strict term limits, a clear and accessible process for recall votes, and recorded video of every meeting. Going forward, all 63 homeowners agreed to formally review the new rules. Grant also spent time with residents who had grown distant from him during the worst months of the conflict, including a couple who had openly avoided him at the mailbox for nearly a year. They apologized for doubting him, admitting they had simply been too afraid of losing their home to risk standing beside anyone who challenged the board. Grant told them there was nothing to apologize for, since fear had always been the exact tool Marlene relied on. And the only real mistake would have been staying silent forever, since silence was the exact thing the scheme had depended on from the very beginning. Carol Simmons, the widow Wayne had mentioned earlier, personally thanked Grant at one of the community cleanup days, saying she finally felt safe enough to ask questions about the budget again without expecting a punishment letter the following week. Near the end of that stretch, Dana called Grant with one final detail. In a deleted email investigators had recovered, Marlene had written that she believed the residents of Silver Pines were too afraid of losing their homes to ever actually check the numbers. It hadn't only been greed driving her. She had built the entire scheme on the assumption that fear would always keep the community quiet, and for years she had been right. In the months leading up to that final stage, the case moved slowly through pretrial hearings, and Grant found himself called in repeatedly to walk prosecutors through the documents he had gathered, explaining line by line how a reserve fund, built up over more than a decade, had been drained in barely 4 years. He wasn't the only witness. Loretta testified about the discrepancies between the printed reports and the online portal. Wayne described the physical inspections that showed no real construction had ever taken place, and even Raymond Ellis was asked to describe what he had seen outside Marlene's house late at night. Beverly's cooperation proved central to the prosecution's case, since her internal knowledge of how invoices were labeled and how transfers were split gave investigators a roadmap they could match directly against the bank records. 14 months later, the case reached its final stage. Marlene accepted a plea agreement, after prosecutors presented thousands of pages of documents, emails, and bank records, and she was sentenced to federal prison, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from ever holding a financial management position again. Miles received his own sentence for wire fraud, money laundering, and invoice fabrication. Denise received a lighter sentence than Marlene but still faced real criminal consequences, while Beverly was given probation, community service, and a restitution obligation after her full cooperation with investigators. Through asset sales and recovered funds, Silver Pines eventually reclaimed the majority of what had been stolen, with the remaining gap covered through liability insurance and a civil settlement. The reserve fund didn't instantly return to its former balance, but the community never had to pay that $12,000 assessment at all. A new 5-member board was elected, with Loretta serving as interim treasurer, under the condition that every report be made fully public. Wayne took charge of the maintenance committee but was barred from signing any contract alone. Grant agreed to serve on the audit committee for 1 year without pay and without ever seeking the role of president. The new system required every homeowner to have online access to the ledger, every contract to be posted before approval, every vote to be permanently recorded, every bank statement reconciled monthly, every contractor to disclose any relationship with board members, and every emergency expense reviewed, again within 7 days of being made. The following annual meeting took place in the very same room where Marlene had been arrested, though the long elevated board table had been replaced with a row of low tables set at the same level as everyone else, and there was no longer a separate stage for the president. Grant stood in the back of the room in almost the exact spot where he had once waited for the FBI to walk through the door. Wayne asked him whether it felt satisfying to watch Marlene lose everything, and Grant said he hadn't started any of this to destroy her. He had only wanted to know where $920,000 had gone. Everything that followed, she had built herself one lie, one fabricated invoice, and one threat at a time, aimed at anyone who dared to ask a question. Loretta presented the community's new financial report, and for the first time in years, every expense came with a matching invoice, a signed contract, and a verified signature. The homeowners voted unanimously to adopt the full transparency policy going forward. Grant looked around the room at the same 63 homes, the same road, the same lake, and the same clubhouse, but Silver Pines itself had changed, because its residents no longer treated the board as an untouchable authority that couldn't be questioned. They understood finally that the HOA existed to serve the homeowners, never the other way around. After the meeting ended, Grant walked out to the parking lot with Wayne, who pointed at a small crack in the pavement and joked that maybe they really should get it fixed after all. Grant glanced at a legitimate repair estimate for $38,000 and smiled. This time, he said they would know exactly where every dollar went. Behind them all, 63 homeowners filed out of the clubhouse one by one, and not a single one of them lowered their head out of fear of another threatening letter. No one in that room believed anymore that the title of HOA president stood above the law, and the chair where Marlene had once ordered an entire neighborhood into silence now sat empty, surrounded by the very financial records she had spent years trying to hide. Not every homeowner walked away from the ordeal unscathed. A handful of families had already sold their houses at a loss during the worst of the intimidation, unable to bear the constant threat of fines and liens, and no restitution order could fully undo the stress those years had caused. Some residents admitted they still felt a flicker of unease walking past the clubhouse, half expecting another letter to appear in their mailbox out of nowhere. But for the 63 households who remained, something fundamental had shifted, because the community had proven to itself that it was possible to stand up to a board that had once seemed untouchable, and that proof mattered more than any single dollar figure ever could. Power was never something that came from a title, a stamp, or a threatening letter slipped under a door. Real power belonged to people who had the right to ask questions, examine the evidence, and hold the people managing their money accountable for every single dollar. Marlene had stolen $920,000 because she believed 63 families would stay frightened and silent forever, and she was wrong about only one thing. Silence can protect a lie for a long time, sometimes for years. But sooner or later, all it takes is one person checking one number correctly, and the whole structure built on that lie comes apart completely.